Nighttime workers of Reddit, what's the freakiest stuff you've seen on the job? I worked at an all-night diner while I was in college. One night at about 2 in the morning, a 4-year-old boy wandered in and said he was there to get some food for him and his little sister because they were hungry. When the manager asked where his parents were, he said they were sleeping at home, and that they slept a lot, and yelled at him and his sister to be quiet a lot. Turns out he lived at an apartment complex adjacent to the diner, and the parents were heroin addicts. It was heartbreaking. I used to work nights in a hospital setting. At one point, I was taking the city bus to work. There was a lady who got off the bus and left her baby. The bus driver pulled the bus over and tried to find her, but it was nighttime and he couldn't find her. He called the police. Before the police got there, the woman came running back, realizing that she had forgotten something. My boss did not believe me when I told her why I was late. Train inspector here. Walking a train in the middle of the night. Pitch black. Come up to a freight car that had 4 hobos sitting in it, just staring at me. Dudes never said a word. Just watched me. I eased by them and kept going, but couldn't get past the feeling of them behind me for a good while. I grew up on a farm. One night I was supposed to check the irrigation pumps at 2 AM. It's a 2-mile drive and I am mostly asleep. I park the truck with the lights aimed at the river. When I get out, the headlights are projecting my shadow on rapid layers of fog coming from the river. Above that, the fog was dissipating into the wildest northern lights display I've ever seen. It was like a sheet being violently shook from one horizon to the other. The farm has no sound or noise pollution. There was nothing else to obscure it. The northern lights have a sound. It's like sand on rough paper. So I took several moments to just take in my silhouette was joined visually to green mist across the sky that filled my vision and my ears. I was working overnight at a hotel and a guy came in with a hookah. Super confidently pours out a little pile of coke on the counter and tells me it's his payment for a room. He was more surprised than anyone should have been when it didn't work. Not freaky, but I was sitting on a loading dock at 3 AM, very dark, smoking a cig. Saw a cat and I tried to get it to come over. It did. It wasn't a cat, it was a raccoon. Still fed it a cracker. Raccoons can be dangerous and are annoying when they get into your cans, but otherwise they are mostly awesome and just looking for a couple of crackers. Not specific to working night shift, but dead people. I work in a nursing home and unfortunately people dying is the name of the game. Sometimes you see people declining, so you know they're on their way out, and you do 15-minute checks on them and catch it fairly quickly. Other times people seem fine and they just go and you don't find them for an hour or so between doing rounds. I stocked shelves at Toys R Us overnight for 5 years. One night, the entirety of 3 walls of board games, 5 shelves tall, 3 feet deep, fell to the floor. Everything, except for a single Ouija board. We left early that night. A coworker who ate a bunch of bananas every single night. Not one. A whole bunch from the supermarket. Not really freaky, but definitely baffling. Would also regularly offer me banana despite me saying every time I'm allergic to them, so no thanks. Just bizarre. He also had a drawer in his desk just stuffed full of staplers. Which I know doesn't sound that weird in an office, but it was at least 20 staplers. None of which had staples in them. And I never saw him use one even once. Our printers had an automatic staple function, so they weren't needed at all. Worked as office cleaner before COVID. 11 to 7 AM as a one-man team. One stormy ass night, I was on the phone while working when my connection started to fade in and out. All of a sudden there is just a deafeningly loud shriek coming out my phone and the power goes out. Even the emergency lights. I remember looking out the window of the 10th and seeing the whole industrial park black. Nights make everything creepy. Used to work overnight at Walmart. I was tasked to stock automotive that night. Furthest corner of the store away from my other co-workers. One of the few times I wasn't listening to music with earbuds in, so I would have heard if someone was near me messing with shit. The doll aisle is only a few feet away from where I'm stocking. I walked past the aisle coming from the warehouse and a doll on the opposite end of the aisle started crying. Scared the black off me. Edit. Spelled aisle incorrectly 3 times lol. A place I worked at until midnight, which used to be a nunnery. The radio would turn on by itself and we would hear footsteps and voices coming from nowhere. It had quite a history and a weird atmosphere which made it freaky at nighttime. As a taxi driver in Glasgow, I once watched Donatello, TMNT, kick the utter shit out of Super Mario while slutty Alice in Wonderland stood by shouting "Fucking leave it, Tom. He's not f***ing worth it. Best Halloween ever." Obligatory not me. But my mom, she was working in a gas station, the only one open 24/7 in my tiny hometown. Well, while she was working, she looked outside the huge front window and saw 2 naked dudes just walking in front of the station. She stood there in shock. Then called 911, but she said it was really funny. Other time. She was working same shift. Some chick decided to shoplift a bottle of wine, I believe it was. And the woman just fled. My mom's boss had been told to hit the emergency button in case this happened again. So she did. Little did she know 5 police patrol cars come, lights flashing, guns drawn, the whole shebang. For a simple shoplift. The police wasn't pleased about it. Okay, the second one could be filed under malicious compliance. After that my mom never touched that button again. I worked as security at medieval times. Walking around by yourself at night in a semi-spooky castle, especially in the torture devices room, can be pretty scary. I was leaving work at 11:30 the other night and I hit a fatus with the door when I was leaving. Scared the shit out of both of us. Edit. I just realized I left out the word raccoon. I used to work night shift maintenance at a recycling plant. You'll be amazed at all the sex toys and porn people throw away. A bunch of dirty dildos flopping down conveyor belt and Polaroids of amateurs. A gorilla. I work at Walt Disney World in Florida. And more specifically, I work at Animal Kingdom, which is half theme park, half zoo. Now, due to Disney's conservation efforts, they give the animals quite a bit of freedom. They are enclosed, but the enclosures are very large. And their sleep areas are well outside of guest view. It's actually a pretty great setup for the animals. We also don't confine them to their sleep areas at night. So I was working the graveyard shift. 10:30 PM to 8:00 AM. And as I turned the corner to cross a bridge into the next area, I see a massive figure on the other side of the bridge. One of the gorillas had gotten out of their enclosure and was just walking around the park. I nearly shat myself. As if you know anything about gorillas, they can be pretty violent. I called it into my boss and they told me that this happens sometimes and to just stay away from it and they will get the caretakers to come do their thing. Honestly, it was the craziest thing I've seen in my time there. I was driving home from work one morning at around 3 AM, half day for me, and I am listening to a book. I look down for a moment to check the remaining time in that chapter and then back at the road. I notice headlights in my lane and think nothing of it for a moment. My phone chirps and I look down again to see what the notification was and think to myself, I saw headlights in my lane. I look back up and see very bright headlights rapidly approaching and swerve just in time to miss the large truck barreling down the highway in the opposite direction. I worked a 12-hour shift, 6 PM to 6 AM, for a trucking company in the IT department. I was the only person in the entire upstairs and after midnight, the only person in the building, running around in between cubicles passing out reports for the next day in near total darkness. Every once in a while a random phone extension would begin ringing. It would ring and ring and ring and ring and not stop. I would have to hunt it down and answer it. But there would never be anyone on the line. Would always creep me out. I would ask other operators that worked nights if they experience the same thing and they have. A technician for the phone co would dismiss it as a glitch in the switching system. But still creepy. My dad used to work as a nighttime janitor at our local mall, and he told me a story about this secluded area of the mall that had a mini carousel, the kind that operates of quarters. He remembers that one night he was just mopping near the secluded area when all of a sudden he hears carnival music, so he goes to check it out, and when he gets there he finds it empty but the carousel was on. Husband's story, not mine. Back in the day when he was a newly qualified nurse, and the only male one on the ward, patients and their families would pass on thanks to the male nurse that spent the night taking to the patient in a private room. Only thing was, no men had been on duty overnight. Once or twice you would think the patient was confused. But this happened often enough, and with patients that were perfectly lucid, that you had to think twice about what was happening. I really am surprised they don't set more horror films in hospitals. The long echoing corridors. On-site morgues. Definitely creepy. I'm a nurse, so I see a lot of freaky stuff working days at the hospital as well, but I used to work nights. There's a common phenomenon amongst dementia patients called sundowning. A dementia patient can be sweet and innocent all day, but once night falls they do a complete 180 and become agitated and often hostile. Also, more patients die on night shift for some reason. They always seem to want to crash around 3 AM. I work in a hotel and have seen some stuff. A guy came in, put both hands on the desk and stared through me. I asked him if I could help him multiple times, but he looked like he wasn't there. His mate came in, grabbed him by the arm and took him out again. Had to check the cameras to make sure that happened. I worked freelance security, or bouncing, assignments during college. One October I worked Oktoberfest and was in charge of guarding the beer keg tent. Sometime around 4 AM a guy goes running down the street as if he's out for a jog. Except he was stark naked, including being barefoot. I work at a factory and I'm like 90% sure we have a ghost in the building. Weirdest thing that's happened was when I was the only one in the building one night. I hear a huge crash come from the warehouse side of the building. I go over to investigate, thinking a truck driver that came to pick a load hit the building or something. Turns out an entire pallet of product, over 1,000 pounds, was yeeted from the third level racking. Night shift nurse here. It isn't freaky anymore because you get used to a lot of things with this job, but when you have a patient with dementia that sundowns, fairly alert and oriented during the day, much more confused at evening night, and you walk by their room at 3 AM and hear this normally sweet old lady just cackling at the darkness. Bigfoot, or some other giant ape in the mountains of Afghanistan via drone footage. 3 others and I were watching a bunch of random live feeds in our command center since there wasn't much else going on that night. The drone blew it up. Whatever it was. I work a night shift at a fancy club and my desk is right across from the bar. I frequently get drunk men coming over and threatening me, non-binary, female presenting, to stay safer they'll pay me while I'm walking to my car. Scares the shit out of me every time. Back in the day I was a security guard. My job was to watch the corporate pool and park at night. This was out in the boonies. Every hour I had to walk the perimeter and key this clock thing. It could get spooky at times. One night I was walking the perimeter and it felt like something was watching me from the woods. I thought it was my imagination, but I couldn't get it out of my head. My second trip around I was walking and I heard something in the woods. Something big. I was scared. So much so I left work a couple hours early. No one ever checked in. The next day when I was checking in at the manager's house at the factory, they asked if I saw the cow. It turns out a cow got free from a nearby farm and wandered into the park. I'm pretty sure I was stalked by a dairy cow. Heard lots of stories from people who have worked in old people's homes. Some of the stories are about the dying residents seeing deceased loved ones shortly before dying. And others are about the usual paranormal happenings you'd expect in haunted locations. I used to be a night manager for Sonic. I had just been through a pretty bad breakup. We had been together for a long time and basically lived as though we were a married couple. One night I was in the back parking lot smoking and saw a man walk in around picking up change. I went to bring him my jar of change I keep in my car. He insisted I not give it to him, but I did. Just asked to being my jar back. About an hour later he brings the jar back. It's still full and he put a $5 bill and a little newspaper clipping with a quote circled. I can't remember exactly what it said, but hit pretty close to home at the time. We talked for a while. And turns out he's a writer. He told me he used to do mission work with kids in other countries. He said he picks up change to remind himself to stay humble. It really made me relook at my situation and gave me a way better outlook on life from then on. Work knock at a nursing home for a while. At 2 AM I heard curse right behind me. The hair stood up on my neck and I turned to nobody behind me. The entire floor was asleep. At the hospital I worked a night shift and my floor had cameras for every bed. Used for patients with behavioral issues. We saw orbs dance around the screen a bunch, even the patients saw them. The Filipino woman said those were trapped souls of patients who have died and then learned that you always open the windows after someone has passed so their soul can leave. I worked a night shift a few years ago in a train station. About 2 AM I noticed a street lamp down the street go out. A second later the whole room went pitch black. I mean so dark the first thing I did was tap my chest to make sure I was alive. The magnetic release on the office door was dead so I was able to just walk out. I could hear banging and turned the corner to see the automatic doors opening and closing repeatedly. The large LED screen behind the barriers, which showed the train's times, was flickering up and down. Like the old Nokia game Snake. Just going boogaloo. I went up to the control office and the nighttime controller said he didn't know what had happened but the phone lines were down too. I walked around the station and it was just eerie. The doors were opening and closing for a few minutes and then stopped. It turned out to be a massive power surge at the substation, which is right next to the station. When I went home at 6 AM the electric company and telephone company were still there trying to fix things. I'll never forget it. Worked overnights in a knock for a company that got Americans online. During an outage call a couple of co-workers decided to get frisky in the boardroom. Somehow they managed to take themselves off mute. Yes, they were on the call during the deed. I honestly don't care who's f-king whom or frankly where. But how could you think that was a good idea? I suppose it's not that freaky. But when I was working third shift at Wally World, we had particular sets of customers that would come in frequently around the same time. Watching a bunch of exhausted cops chatting with a bunch of hyper drag queens was really entertaining. When I still had the dairy herd, I would spend the night in the barn sometimes. The situation was this. If I had a cow that was due to calf and she was known for a difficult calving, I would get up, dress, and go out and check on her once every 2 hours. Occasionally, if it was during a cold winter night, I would just take an alarm clock and sleep in the barn. The barn was 45 degrees. So I would set up a straw bale bed on the driveway. Use an old coat for a pillow. Stay dressed with gloves on and cover with an old tarp. Usually had a dog and several barn cats piled on to keep me warm. I woke up in the night, I kept the main lights on, with a big tomcat laying on my chest, just staring at me. Work at the door. We had someone overdose on the property in the restroom. Some security with first aid gear sprinted by, along with transmissions on the radio to keep the air clear due to the medical emergency. An ambulance finally arrived. Me and the other guy I was working with hauled things out of the way for the paramedics and their stretcher to get through. An otherwise quiet night. So me and the other guy were mulling over the outcome. He wondered if the person that overdosed was gonna make it. But as if on cue, the medics and stretcher came back, empty. We had our answer. No fanfare or conclusion like the movies. The coroner showed up a little later. I saw a woman on meth strip down and try to shove gift cards up her butt while hiding in the plants in lawn and garden. She then tried to climb the fence, fell and broke her arm. I worked the graveyard shift at a 4-star hotel. I was the security dispatcher. I usually had to stay in the office all night, but sometimes I would go for a ride on the electric cart with one of the security officers. I was 18 and this was my first full-time job. One night, we were riding the electric cart around the hotel. The scenery was beautiful. The hotel was by the bay. In front of the hotel was a pond with about 7 real flamingos in it. As we made our way to the front, we made a horrible discovery. Someone, somehow without being seen, had decapitated all of the flamingos and took their heads with them. I used to drive through Vancouver's downtown east side at 3:30 am every morning to go to work at a law enforcement type facility. I'm talking Main and E. Hastings. 15 or so years ago, I saw some stuff on that drive. I found the best plan was to go 10 under the speed limit to avoid the large number of people just like shuffling through the road constantly, but never come to a full stop. I treated all the traffic lights like a 4-way and took a rolling stop. There wasn't much car traffic on the roads at that time besides cops anyway. Went for a walk around 3 am with my co-worker and we saw a dead body. Young girl in her early 20s. Skin color was off. Clearly dead. This was in a public square, our city's version of Times Square. So lots of people walk there at night. We didn't get involved. By the time we circled the block the cops were there. And an ambulance. They didn't rush her off to the hospital. I guess she had been dead a while. So they were doing the whole crime scene thing and we pieced. Still, it was eerie to actually see a dead body in real life. The hospital I work at has a couple reoccurring ghost stories. The man in the blue suit and the little girl. I've had patients ask about the man standing in the corner when there is no one there. But hearing them ask if they can help the lost little girl is scarier. Once at the pizza place I worked at, a lady and her boyfriend who were both probably drunk or high tried to attack a customer in the parking lot, banging on his car and yelling. Right in front of the large windows where we could see them. My boss, a big, scary Greek man, had to go outside and physically restrain that woman until the cops showed up while her boyfriend stood by with the dumbest look on his face. The foreign couple in the shop were the only 2 customers at the time and they watched through the window the entire time. Must have been the highlight of their trip. Nothing whilst I was at work and lots of very drunk people as I left to go catch the first train home in the morning at around 4 am. But about once every 6 weeks the first train would be delayed due to a potential suicide being spotted on a gantry waiting or psyching themselves up to jump under a train. Working night shift at the George Washington Bridge saw a guy pacing back and forth on the pedestrian walkway. He was pacing for a while so we called Port Authority. The officer came, told the guy from a distance to think of what he's doing, it's not worth it. Guy just jumped into the Hudson River, found out he was just 21 years old. I worked in casinos for more than a decade. I've seen fights, drug use, blatant prostitution and theft. I have known customers who have been arrested for human trafficking, fraud, murder and links to terrorist financing. I've seen every possible bodily secretion. I've seen affairs start and be discovered, fortunes won and, more often, lost. The freakiest thing? I saw someone impact the floor after a multi-story jump off a building. Can't get that one out of my head. I worked a security job many years ago. One time they had me work back-to-back 14-hour shifts with no break in between. You can imagine I was pretty much the Walking Dead by the end. In fact, I was so sleep deprived that I started to hallucinate that a cow was walking by while I was a gate guard. That's right. I hallucinated a freaking cow. It was fully detailed and clear as day. A brown and white cow just walking about and occasionally grazing. Of course I knew it wasn't real. I remember looking at it and thinking, whoa, I really need some sleep. Worked graveyard shift as a bellman. I would have pre-scheduled pickups of bags at around 3 to 5 am for all the Japanese that booked through a travel agency. One night I rode the elevator up at around 3 am. Elevator doors open and I walk into the hallway. I look down to the hallway and there is this 2-3-year-old Japanese kid standing in the hallway facing away from me crying. I froze up. The kid slowly turns around and looks at me. Just as the parents open their door looking for their child. The kid must have accidentally let herself out of the room and didn't know where she was. Scared the shitty out of me though. Thought I was gonna have to punt a demon baby down the hall. Was working at a distribution center years ago unloading overseas cargo containers. Typically, all the product was coming from China, Vietnam, etc. I cracked open the seal to a container and a cat ran out, and I mean he ran like he was on fire. He tore off so fast that we lost sight of him almost instantly and didn't even bother to look for him. Best case scenario, he got outside. Worst, we had a warehouse Mauser. I hope like hell that cat snuck inside at the US port and wasn't in there since China.